I'll actually let Pam introduce the topic. This is her baby, and I'm just here to help. So Pam, I'll let you start.
All right. Well, it was lovely to see all those familiar or somewhat familiar faces. And yeah, so Tiffany and I here are here to talk about a really important part of, or can be a very important part of care for people with Parkinson's, which is preventing interference of diet with their levodopa carbidopa through what's called a protein redistribution diet. So we'll start with disclosures here. So next slide. Great. So as is fairly obvious, I am the owner of Acacia Health Limited. So just that's my main disclosure. I don't have any other disclosures. And Tiffany?
And I don't have any disclosures or brand affiliations. I like to mention that because I do show sometimes like some food labels, some examples of different foods. I'm not going to benefit if you buy these foods. I have nothing against other foods. I just using them as examples.
Great. Okay. So first of all, some introductions in who we are. So I'm Pamela Hutchison, and I'm a naturopathic doctor. I've been in practice in Victoria for 20 years. And the whole time I've focused my practice on neurological and mental health. And I have a specific passion in working with people with Parkinson's, which has driven me all over the world to World PD Congresses, like the one in Portland in 2016. I went to Kyoto in 2019, and I'm hoping to go to Barcelona in 2022 for the World Congress. And I also volunteer with Dr. Lori Mishley, who some of you might be doing her PD School online program. And before COVID, I was lucky enough to attend PD School in the summer of 2019 and help out with the care of patients at that time. And then a little bit about me. I love exercise. Anything that involves a run, a swim, and a bike is my jam. I love being outdoors, and I love exercising outdoors.
All right, and obviously my name is Tiffany. I am a registered dietitian. I've had a wide range of experience in the dietitian world, mostly in community health. That was my biggest one. I worked in a community health center in a remote community in Northern Ontario, where I really was able to use my entire scope because I was the only dietitian for quite a while. And so I was able to work with kids, older adults, diabetes, all different chronic diseases. I will admit I have not worked with Parkinson's a ton. A lot of the things that I've done there's a lot of crossover. For example, working with someone who has chronic kidney disease and they need a low protein diet, some things transfer over. But Pam's enthusiasm is quite contagious, and so I'm pretty excited to be here talking to you today. I am new to Victoria and to Acacia Health. I moved here in July, but so far so good. And I'm also a big fan of running and biking. However, I was a competitive rower for about 10 years, and so I really prefer to be on top of the water. So I have not done a triathlon.
And then a little bit about what we do. If you're not familiar with naturopathic medicine, in order to become a naturopathic doctor, you need to do 4 years of postgraduate training. So I did mine after I got my bachelor's of science. We are trained as primary care providers. We're trained to focus on preventative medicine, individualizing our care plans to the person and their particular needs. So essentially treating the person first versus treating the disease. And then of course, considering the whole person, the whole body of that individual that we're working with. We have a strong emphasis on using the least invasive care options first. In BC, we're able to order laboratory studies, so blood tests. And in BC, naturopathic physicians have prescriptive authority for a limited formulary, which in BC means that I can manage someone's levocarbidopa Cinemet prescription, but not their dopamine agonists, for example. There's a line of limitation around what we can and cannot prescribe, and dopamine agonists were not included in our formulary. But I do regularly work with people who are taking levocarbidopa and help with management of levocarbidopa prescriptions.
All right, and a little bit about dietitians. I often get asked, what's the difference between a dietitian and a nutritionist? Nutritionists they're just not regulated as much. There's nothing wrong with nutritionists, but sometimes, somebody can take an online course and then call themselves a nutritionist. And so sometimes it's good to just check in with what people's credentials are. Dietitians do have to do a minimum of 4 years of undergrad plus a 1,300-hour placement and write a national exam in order to be registered. And then every year you have to prove that you're providing evidence-based, person-centered ethical care, and that you're doing ongoing education. So I can't just get my degree and then say I'm a dietitian and that's it. So we have to be showing that we're constantly trying to improve. And staying on top of the most recent information. And the main thing that RDs do is that we really help to translate the science of nutrition into things that people can actually apply to their lives. So it's not that helpful to know, the science behind something, or you need this many grams of that nutrient, and what does that actually mean on the plate? So that's sort of what we do the most.
Great. So thanks, Tiffany. So what we're here to talk about today is the protein redistribution diet. And the first thing to really establish, I think, is why we're talking about this. So most of you have experience with levodopa, carbidopa. And for the purpose of this presentation, we'll just call it levodopa. So levodopa has been used for a long time. It's remains, even after 70 years, the most effective medication for managing Parkinson's disease. And there's a point in many people's experience with Parkinson's where they start to notice that the medication has what are called motor fluctuations. So these are things like they can feel the medication wear off earlier than their next dose kicks in. And they can have symptoms like freezing or stiffness that come in before the next dose starts to work. So these motor fluctuations are less common at the beginning, but even sometimes at the beginning of people's early experiences with Parkinson's, they will notice that meals seem to interfere with the effects of their levodopa carbidopa. It's more common again as things progress. And what they're noticing usually is that there's a competition problem happening between protein content in the meal and their uptake of their levodopa. One solution for this is to do a protein redistribution diet, which can reduce those motor fluctuations, but it also can present some new challenges in terms of nutritional status, digestive function, and other things. So one really key element to success with a protein redistribution diet is to really understand it and be well educated and supported in implementing it. Next slide. Thank you. So to start to introduce this concept to you, the first thing that I think is important to have super clear is just what are all the steps for levodopa to go from that pill in the pill container into dopamine in your brain. And so most of the time we're taking levodopa as an oral route. And it has to go through all these different steps. For instance, it has to be broken down by stomach acid. Your stomach needs to empty into the small intestine where the drug is absorbed in that upper small intestine. Then from there, it needs to travel through the bloodstream to the brain. And then once it's in the bloodstream at the border between the brain and the bloodstream, it needs to cross what's called the blood-brain barrier. And this is an important barrier that's there to protect your brain from toxins and other things that can be problematic for it that are in your bloodstream. And so the brain has this way of ensuring that only what it needs and wants gets to the cells. And so we need to make sure that the levodopa crosses that blood-brain barrier and enters the brain. And once the levodopa carbidopa is in your brain, the levodopa can get broken down into dopamine. There are challenges that people then can have in terms of absorption of the medication that are based on all of those steps. So one thing that we probably have heard about or are aware of is that we actually need good stomach acid in order to have good breakdown of levodopa in order to absorb it. Our stomachs need to empty because we don't absorb through the stomach lining. We need to have that regular stomach emptying in order for us to have a regular drug effect. That can present a challenge because there's a lot of, as people know, there's a lot of challenges with the motor function of the gut in Parkinson's, and sometimes stomach emptying is delayed for various reasons. The big thing that we're going to be talking about today is this idea of competition with other nutrients for access to the receptor sites that allow that drug to move from the gut into the bloodstream. There is also, of course, if you have problems with absorption, if your small intestine absorptive surface is inadequate, you won't be able to absorb your levodopa. So sometimes that's a challenge that's going on. Sometimes we're having problems with the actual bacteria that are in our gut. They can be acting on the drug. If there's too many of them, they can be breaking it down too early and causing problems with us basically having more dopamine in our gut than in our brain. We want that dopamine to be formed in our brain, not in our gut, but microbiome action can actually turn levodopa into dopamine in the gut. Constipation can affect transit time, meaning how quickly the bowel is moving, and that can affect and slow down drug uptake. And then, of course, there's competition again for entry in across that blood-brain barrier. So we've got competition to get from the small intestine into your bloodstream, and we have competition getting from your bloodstream into your brain. So this is the diagram on the left-hand side of your screen is from a study where they were looking at how gut bacteria and diet affects drug kinetics in Parkinson's disease. And I thought this was a handy, it looks complicated, but I'm going to break it down, and it's a handy way to visualize what's happening. So the most important thing on here is for you to know what the different sections of the drawing are. So at the bottom of this drawing is a bunch of little dots, and this sort of beige area is part of the small intestine. And then there's 3 cells, that's the intestinal lining. Then the red area represents the bloodstream. And then the next set of cells is the blood-brain barrier. And at the very top of the slide is the brain. And what you can see is that there's these blue dots. These blue dots are levodopa, and we're trying to get those blue dots all the way up into the brain where it gets changed into the triangles, which are the dopamine. So essentially they're demonstrating here is that levodopa needs to be transported through transporter proteins. And these are these like little globs that are on the cells. You'll see they look like little brown kind of almond shape or yellow shape, almond shaped or gray shaped little protein globules. And what they represent is basically the gatekeepers for getting levodopa up in through the cells and then through to the brain. There's competition from large neutral amino acids who also are using the same transporters to get across the various membranes. And then there's also competition even with levothyroxine, liothyronine. So these are thyroid medications can also be competing. Gabapentin, another medication, can also be competing as you go through the various portals. There's different things that are competing for absorption into the brain. So essentially with this, it's driving home the point that when we are trying to optimize the amount of levodopa that gets into your brain, we need to ensure that we are addressing this competition with the amino acids that also want to get through the same gates that the levodopa need to use to get through all of these different barriers and get into the brain. Next slide. Thank you. So essentially what this is saying is that was kind of complicated, but essentially what it's saying is that what you take in at the same time that you take in your levodopa, or around the same time or close to you taking the levodopa, makes a difference. It makes a difference in how much competition there is for that drug to get through all of those barriers into your brain. That's why there's this general recommendation that you take levodopa at least 30 minutes before and up to 1 to 2 hours after eating. It's also why gastric emptying, this concept of your stomach emptying on time, is important, because the timing of that, if your stomach is emptying slowly or late, then you are going to have problems with the drug arriving later than expected to your small intestine where you absorb it, but also that you will also have problems with the potential for mixing, unintentional mixing of your medication with the contents of a meal that you had a decent time before you took the med. So sometimes that gastric emptying issue is a bigger problem for drug effect than you might think. So we're going to take just one moment here for Tiffany to go through some dietary strategies, and if you think that you have slow gastric emptying.
Yeah, so just a couple points on that. There are some easy things that you can try if you're worried about having delayed gastric emptying. So one of the things, and it may seem obvious to some people and it's something you don't think about for others, but just having smaller meals. So a larger meal takes longer to digest. That's just a fact. And then also taking the time to eat, taking time to chew your food, because chewing is actually an important trigger for digestion. Plus, when you chew your food well, your body doesn't have to work as hard to digest all of those pieces. Something else to consider is trying to use some more liquid or semi-liquid foods, and that would be something like smoothies or pureed soups. Those digest quite a bit faster than solid foods, so it's something that you can try. Higher fat meals also delay gastric emptying. However, if you are using the more liquid foods or smoothies, shakes, things like that, and you add fat into those, that's not as big of an issue because you already have the quicker digestion from the liquid options. Less meat and less fiber. And of course, these are things, you want to have fiber because you don't want to be constipated. It's just going to be a matter of timing those higher fiber foods and sort of distributing them in a good way throughout the day. And then also just moving after your meals. So trying to go for a short walk if you can. And if you can't, because not everybody can, at a minimum, just try not to lay down for at least an hour. Try to stay upright, putter around. Even if you're sitting, it's a little bit better than going and having a nap.
Yeah, and so one other thing I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention is how you might know that you are having delayed gastric emptying. You may not have any symptoms at all that tell you that that's happening for you. You might experience real, what's called early satiety. So this experience of being full much earlier than you would normally expect for yourself, with less food, essentially. And some people will report this feeling of just foods, a feeling of almost like a rock in their stomach, or like a feeling like there's like the food is stuck, or it's sitting there a long time. Those can be symptoms of delayed gastric emptying. There are tests that can be done to confirm it. It is sometimes a problem for people with Parkinson's that's related to just motor problems in Parkinson's. And yes, you can, as mentioned, you can have it and not know that that's going on for you. So essentially what we're trying to say is that when we're talking about the protein redistribution diet, what we're really trying to address is this idea of competition, and that the more that we can limit the amount of large neutral amino acids that are from protein containing foods being in your gut and in your bloodstream at the same time as your levodopa, we will get more levodopa into your brain. So of course, this is always step one then. So whenever we want to, before we do any kind of protein redistribution diet, before we engage in something that's more challenging, the first thing to do is ensure that you've trialed pretty restrictively this approach of taking your levodopa 30 minutes before or 1 to 2 hours after a proteinaceous meal. That can be a very practical thing to do, and it's easier to accommodate, of course, if you are taking your levodopa every 4 hours. Now, a lot of people are taking their levodopa every 3 hours, sometimes every 2.5 hours, and that becomes a practical impossibility to do this approach. And so again, redistributing your protein might be a way for you to get the most out of your levodopa and still be able to take your medication at the frequency that's working for you. So a good question to be asking is this actually an appropriate trial for you, something that would make sense for you to trial? So usually some of the indicators that you are having problems with protein competing with your levodopa uptake will be things like there being a longer time for your levodopa to kick in. So it might have taken 20 or 30 minutes. Now you're waiting 40 minutes for it to kick in. The size of the benefit, so the amount of symptom control you're getting, could be going down. You could notice that it's wearing off faster, so the duration of your benefit is limited. That you're getting what are called dose failures, so where you take Cinemet and you're waiting for it to kick in and it just never does. And then of course the early wearing off of a previously effective dose. So sometimes people will have variations to the day where in the morning the medication works fine, but then in the afternoon they're having problems with their medication essentially having the same duration of benefit. And a lot of times people will have figured this out, that there's some kind of association with eating. And because a lot of people with Parkinson's get really well educated about levodopa, they can be completely aware that, of course, this is, it seems to be more likely to happen with protein containing food or containing meals, sorry. So essentially, this problem is again, it's variable. So some people will notice this right away, but most of the time it's more likely to show up when people are in more advanced stages of Parkinson's. And the thinking is that the brain has less storage of dopamine to ride you through those times where there might be like a delay in the new supply of dopamine from levodopa. There may also be some cumulative issues with uptake, circulation, other types of issues that are further delaying the arrival of levodopa, making it again more challenging for there to be this stable drug effect. So then one way to figure out if a protein redistribution diet would be helpful for you is to do a trial of a low protein diet, which is best done with some help from an ND or a dietitian or a GP. And in this case, what you're doing is for about 4 or 5 days, you're having a trial of removing most of the all of the high protein foods from your diet and tracking how your medication responds, like how your medication response changes or doesn't to what you've done. It's usually good to get a baseline, so tracking your medication response and diet for 1 to 2 days ahead of time, and then you start a low protein diet, and then you track while you're on the low protein diet, you're tracking your medication response and your diet for those 4 to 5 days. It's not unusual for me to see people within even the first 2 days to be pretty confident that they are getting a change in their medication effect. And so it's not always necessary to continue for 4 to 5 days. I wanted to include a couple examples of sheets that you can use to help track if you're doing this. So one is, this is Dr. Lori Mishley's most recent version of her record for tracking symptom fluctuations. This is not just to be used to establish what's happening on a low protein diet. It's also a really handy tracker for looking at, what the patterns are for things like dyskinesia and those symptoms of basically too much dopamine. And what's happening in terms of the frequency of your off symptoms, so your stiffness, your slowness, your tremor, and so forth. So this is helpful also if you're going to go see your movement disorder specialist and you want to bring them a tracking of your symptom fluctuations related to your medication. This can be a handy sheet for that. And then this is a really basic version. This is actually my standard diet tracking sheet that I've been using for ages. But it just gives you a sense of the essentials. You really want to have the date and time, what you ate or drank, with enough detail that you can kind of break down. If it was a sandwich, you want to know it was a ham sandwich with cheese and mustard. You don't need to have the ingredients of what the mustard was made of, but you want to have enough information that essentially, whether it was a high protein or a low protein diet or what was in there. And then you can track your physical symptoms. Sometimes with Parkinson's, if you're getting a low, you might feel really anxious. So sometimes tracking emotional symptoms alongside can be helpful.
So a little bit about how you would do a low protein trial. So some of these probably seem obvious. You're going to try and avoid those typical protein foods that we know about. So pretty much anything that comes from an animal. So your meat, your eggs, your dairy products. But you also want to watch out for like soy products. So while some plant-based milks are very low in protein, soy milk's going to be high, tofu, as well as your beans, lentils, nuts, things like that. And I would also caution against some of the high protein grains like quinoa, just because if you are trying to do this low protein trial, you want to make sure that you're staying on top of it. And then of course, we have to know also what can we eat, not just what we can't eat. So vegetables in general, so I'm going to get to this a little bit later. I didn't include it right now, but some vegetables are a bit higher in protein. So you want to be cautious, but in general, about 1 to 2 grams per serving for any of these foods here on this screen. And then things like oils are good for boosting up your calories, because if you're cutting out all your protein foods, you're going to be hungry. You might go a little bit lower in the calories than you should. And so as much as it doesn't sound the most appealing, but adding in olive oil to a smoothie, for example, is a good way to just boost up your calories without adding any protein.
So when you're done, the interpretation really comes down to, do you feel like your levodopa is working better? If it's working better, you're having less off times, you're having quicker ons, you're getting a better drug effect size. That is a sign that reducing protein in your diet has reduced competition and it's working better. Sometimes when people do these low protein diet trials, they'll forget that they're having a low protein diet and have a higher protein meal, which can sometimes be an opportunity as well to see if when you have a high protein meal, does it actually create an off? So tracking can be helpful because it'll pick up on those times where you had a higher protein meal, had an off, and it can kind of help confirm the results.
Can also sometimes help you realize that a food was higher in protein than you thought it was.
Absolutely. And if it doesn't make a difference, and of course there's other considerations that we've talked about earlier, which are things like perhaps you're having delayed gastric emptying and you want to go back to that slide and go through Tiffany's tips on how to address that. If you're constipated, it might be also part of the problem as to why you're having motor fluctuations with your medication. Dehydration, again, it's remarkable to me how many times, particularly with folks with Parkinson's, that we're dealing with a lot of dehydration, in large part because there is a loss of some of the neurons that indicate thirst. And so people often are not thirsty enough in a sense with Parkinson's. They'll have low thirst for needs. If you have low stomach acid, of course, that's going to delay or affect the breakdown of your medication, and you can have dose failures and other problems there. Small intestine bacterial overgrowth. This is a big topic, but essentially this is something to explore if other avenues are not showing improvements in your levodopa, and you have certain symptoms like you get super bloated after eating, or you have a lot of gas or a lot of problems with burping and reflux. Sometimes that's related to small intestine bacterial overgrowth, and that can be playing a role in basically breaking down your medication before it has a chance to get to your brain. If you have undiagnosed celiac, that could be causing a loss of absorptive surface for your small intestine. That can be a problem, obviously, for absorbing your medication. And then, of course, I think if you're doing this and you're getting still lots of motor fluctuations, you know, of course, like see your movement disorder specialist or your neurologist. Are there other things that can be done to assist you? And if it does help, so if you find that a low protein diet makes a difference, then it might be a reasonable thing for you to do to prolong the stage that you have good levodopa response in the long arc of having Parkinson's disease. The longer that we can improve your levodopa response, the better quality of life you obviously have. And so it can be a very reasonable thing for you to bring in. It's also challenging. And so I think one of the most important elements for success with a protein redistribution diet is really education and support. And that's where Tiffany's going to take over, is basically taking the reins around education and support.
All right, so now that you're thinking about a protein redistribution diet, let's talk a little bit about how we might do that and what some of the things you need to think about are. So first of all, why is protein important? If reducing the protein in your diet takes away these symptoms, why can't I just have a low protein diet always? Protein, amino acids, these are the building blocks of life. Unfortunately, you need to have them. Protein is important for brain health. I know that when we typically think about nutrients in the brain, we think about fat, but the way that neurons communicate is with amino acid neurotransmitters, and so you do need to have some protein coming in. It's also important for bone health, and with Parkinson's, there is an increased risk often for osteoporosis, osteopenia. And again, we usually think about calcium, vitamin D, but about 1/3 of your bone mass is protein. And those proteins are constantly turning over and regenerating. And so it's important that we're supplying the things that we need to regenerate that healthy bone. And of course, it's also important for muscle strength. So if you want to keep on moving into your older age, you want to be having some protein. You want to maintain your muscle mass, and maintaining your muscle mass is also going to help with your bone strength. So it all plays in together. And then of course, we also need protein for all the other organs, your hair and your skin and everything like that too. So how much protein do we actually need? And this is kind of a funny question. There's not always a perfect answer for everyone. 0.8 grams per kilo is the amount that is considered the RDA, so the recommended daily allowance for healthy Canadians. So this is for someone who is not malnourished and they're not undergoing any metabolic stress. However, depending on your condition, different people might need more. So if you've just had surgery, if you've had an infection, if you have had a lot of weight loss, or if you're extremely active, you need more. And for some people, if they're hypermetabolic, it might actually be up to 2.5. For example, if someone has cancer or if they're performing at a high performance level as an athlete. But on the whole, 0.8 to 1 gram per day is sort of the regular recommendation. And a lot of people get this amount without trying, except for vegans and people who are doing like very strict weight loss diets. Sometimes they're lower. But something to try as well is just taking stock of what you are taking in. And if you are more at the 1.4 grams per kilo, which a lot of people are, it might be something to try just to dial it back. Lower your protein needs, but still try and meet that RDA and then see what happens. So the standard protein redistribution diet. So what that looks like is about 7 to 10 grams of protein throughout the first part of the day up until supper, and then the remainder of your protein after. And this number changes a little bit. Some people can go up to 15 grams in the daytime. And that's something that every person who tries to do this diet, you'll have to experiment a little bit and play around with the numbers and find something that works for you. But on the whole, this is sort of the general recommendation. So if we were to do a little case study, I'm going to show you a couple diet examples of how this might look. So we're going to pretend that we've got this person here. Let's call, that's his friend. It's a man. They're 154 pounds, and I'm suggesting that they're going to have 1 gram per kilo of protein, so that's 70 grams. And then we're going to dissect what their dietary intake might look like. So just revisit that. So you can build your diet around this schedule, depending on what your medication timing looks like, is how we would base your diet. So, but here's an example. I've created this diet. Got little pictures over here. So we've got about 2,300 calories. Which is probably going to meet Fred's needs, and we're reaching 73 grams of protein. And you'll notice that some of the things in this diet, they don't always look like the foods that you would classify as super healthy foods. One unfortunate thing with a low protein diet is that a lot of the higher protein grains and things like your whole grains, your healthy high fiber grains that everybody loves, they're often a little bit higher in protein. And so sometimes we're choosing things that don't necessarily look like the ideal foods, but we make up for it in other ways. So I've got here, you know, a slice of toast with margarine. I know that controversial margarine, but you can take it out. And a tablespoon of jam. I've put a smoothie in there because smoothies are just such an easy way to grab extra calories. You can throw extra fiber in there without adding a lot of extra protein. And you can also throw extra fat. So I've got avocado oil in that smoothie. That's going to be kind of a mild oil that you can't really taste. It's going to add a little bit of body and some extra calories so that you're getting a good breakfast to start your day. Lunch is one that's a challenge for people. You can't always have a nice sandwich. Well, you can. In my next slide, we do a sandwich. But so you can see it. It's mostly going to be vegetable, fruit based with some saltine crackers. Again, the average person who comes into my office, I'm not telling them they should have saltines, but in this case, they're a better choice than some other crackers in terms of protein. And of course, during the day, you're going to get hungry. You're going to need to know some foods that you can go for snacks. Things like apples, they're pretty low. You only get about 0.5 grams of protein in an apple. So that would be a safer choice. And then dinner is where it gets fun, because this is where you get to add your protein foods back in. So, and I tried to make them meals that aren't extensively huge, because nobody wants to be so full that you can't move for the rest of your night. So 7 ounces of salmon, it actually is not that much. It would be about 2 servings, but that's what the average person usually eats when they have fish or meat. And some quinoa and some broccoli. So I'll get to it in a bit, but broccoli is actually not a bad source of protein in terms of plants. And so you might as well maximize it when you can. And then I also include a bedtime snack. So pretty much every person who's doing a protein redistribution diet, you're going to be having a bedtime snack, because that's just an easy way to get in the extra proteins that you need before you go to bed. And it's not a huge snack. It's pretty reasonable size. You know, 1 piece of toast with some almond butter and a cup of milk. That's all. So this diet looks not outrageous, I think, and it meets the needs for protein. It actually meets your daily calcium needs, your daily fiber needs. It's low in saturated and trans fat, like it's below the limits, and it's also low in sodium. So this is overall, we've created a healthy diet while still meeting the needs of the protein redistribution. So then some people wonder, can I still reach these goals if I don't eat meat? Because sometimes those protein amounts sound extremely large if you don't eat meat or eggs or dairy. And so I've made this one here to be completely plant-based to show you that you can. So this diet plan here is actually higher in protein than the first one. It's also very high in fiber. So if you're going to try this and you don't usually eat a ton of fiber, be careful if you add this day in. You might want to take out some of the extra fiber sources, because it's 63 grams of fiber, which is pretty high for a lot of people. And again, it meets your calcium needs, and it's low in saturated and trans fat. And you'll see that it's like I've got your protein foods here are going to be lots of beans, lentils, those protein dense legumes. And then you've also got some nuts and seeds here in this salad. And then a bedtime smoothie, which is an easy way to add some protein. So I do use protein powder in this one. That's something that you don't have to. Even without that scoop of protein powder, this day probably still would have met the limit, but just giving you some ideas of ways that you can boost up the nutrition in a diet like this. And then again, at lunchtime, I did use a sandwich here. So it's a little bit higher protein at lunch, and then we had a little bit less at breakfast. So you had that extra room, and it's just going to be a matter of finding foods that you enjoy and that you can work into your diet. So that was the slide from before. So these are the foods you want to be having at nighttime, while these are the ones you want in the day. However, like I mentioned before, I'm going to come back to that now. Some vegetables are actually higher in protein than people would expect, and that's important to consider before you start, before you do your grocery shop. You want to make sure that you're buying things that are going to be working for your diet. So avocados, which are something that would be a great way to get extra calories. If you're just having a quarter of an avocado, that's fine. You're getting 1 gram of protein. But if you have half an avocado, there's 2 grams. And when you are limiting yourself to about 10, 2 is a lot. So it's just being careful with some of these foods. Things like asparagus and broccoli and spinach, they're great things to add into your evening meals, but be careful with them in the daytime. Not that you can't have them, it's just knowing the portion sizes and how much protein you get. And then at the same time, not all breads and pastas and crackers and cereals are created equal. I know in that low protein food slide, they mentioned like 1 to 2 grams, but some of them are going to be higher. Sorry, that steel cut oats is a little bit blurry, but you can see that a 1/4 cup of steel cut oats, which would be considered a healthy option for most people, might not be the healthy option for someone doing a protein redistribution diet for breakfast. So, and then something that, is sort of nutritionally empty, like these rice puffs, that's something that's quite safe. So, I mean, you're not going to get the most bang for your buck in terms of nutrition, but it'll fill you up and be something that you can have for breakfast. Same goes for crackers. So I know Some people get nauseous when they take their medication, and so you want to know some low protein snacks you can have. Crackers are often a good choice. Just making sure that you're choosing crackers that are going to be lower in protein. So, you know, everybody loves Mary's crackers. They're healthy, they're full of fiber, but they've also got 3 grams of protein for a serving size, whereas something like the rice thins have 1 gram. So it's just choosing your foods. And I would recommend having both of these. You know, you have the low protein option for during the day, you have the high protein option for your nighttime snack, and you can still include those tasty, healthy foods that you like. And then bread is a really challenging one. Flour has more protein in it than people expect, especially when you're choosing those ones that everybody recommends, the whole grains, the ancient grains, sprouted grains. They're all going to be a little bit higher in protein. So choosing some of these, like the gluten-free ones that are, you know, sort of rice and potato based, are going to be a little bit lower in protein. So with this, there are, of course, going to be some risks. We always want to be thinking about bone health. If you are eliminating dairy, if you're eliminating soy during the day when you're watching your protein content, you might be missing out on some calcium. I do recommend using some of the plant-based alternatives that are lower in protein, and I'll show you an example, I think in the next slide actually. Constipation, of course, because again, those high fiber options are often higher in protein. So finding those fruits and vegetables and things to make up for that. Weight loss, of course. So if you start this diet already malnourished, it might not be a good idea, because we need to find ways to get those calories up, get the protein up. And if you start the diet and you have some drastic weight loss, then we need to definitely reassess. See where you can add more calories, add more protein, and if you can, then it might not be right for you at this time. You can always gain some weight and come back to it in the future. And then the other thing is sleep quality. Because you're loading your protein into the evening, your evening medication dose might not work as well. And for some people, that is going to cause some issues with sleep. For other people, they aren't as bothered by the symptoms in the evening and at nighttime. So that's going to be independent for each person, depending on how you react. And another thing which Pam didn't mention too is sometimes you can have side effects if your medications start working too well. So if you have had medication dose increases and now you're taking away the protein and they start working really well, you can start having some side effects there as well. So it's important to keep on working with your healthcare team, and you may need to adjust your medication doses. So just a couple notes on calcium. These are sort of your amounts that you need. So men and women, I mean, it's going to be different for men and women, but for example, women 51 to 70 need 1,200, and men need 1,000. So reaching those as much as you can through food is great. So here are some food sources, and it's good to try and, you know, the high protein ones, include them in the evening when you can. Choose those calcium containing vegetables. A lot of them are also the protein containing ones, so that's nice for the evening. And then also go for some of those low protein options. So there's a lot of plant-based milks on the market now. A lot of them don't have as much protein as milk, which for most people is annoying to me. But in this case, it might actually be helpful. So choosing something like a rice milk, and this is nutrition information per half cup serving. So you can see something like rice milk, almond milk. Those are going to be great for putting on your cereal in the morning or putting in your coffee or your tea, because you're not really going to get a huge protein effect from them. And then fiber, of course. We want to reduce the risk of constipation as much as possible. So you want to try and get these, there's two types, insoluble, soluble. Soluble is the one that is really good for helping you go to the bathroom, and choosing some of those foods in your diet to get those. Also inulin, which might help increase the good bacteria in your intestines. So if there's a possibility that that helps, it's like a prebiotic fiber, you might as well include some of these foods like asparagus and onion, just because of that increased constipation risk and the risk of the medication side effects. And then, I know we're running out of time. How want to have room for questions. So people always ask me about supplements. If you are finding, if you're at a stage in your disease progression where you are having a hard time eating, then it's not a bad idea to use something like this if it's necessary. I really go for a food first approach myself. If you can make a smoothie with real foods at home, that's a great idea. If you just don't have the energy, then you just don't have the energy. Something like Nepro, which is designed for people with chronic kidney disease, it only has about 9 grams of protein. It's still high, but it's going to be lower than a lot of the other ones. There's also some that are designed for people with PKU. And there's also a lot of baking products. They're expensive, but if you Google like low protein flour, you're going to come to these websites that are meant for people with PKU, and you can buy a lot of like low protein pastas and flours and baked goods. That would be something that you can supplement your diet with. And then, of course, if you're just looking to boost the protein in the evening, something like even a protein powder added to a shake or to your glass of milk is an option. And of course, there are lots of other options. This is not going to be right for everyone. If someone has, for example, you also have diabetes, which you're managing with medication, you're going to need to make sure that you're also managing those. So you may need to adjust your insulin or your medications or your food timing. And of course, there are other options. You can just decrease the protein. There's 7-to-1 carb protein diets. Those are a whole other talk, so we're not going to get into it today. But if you do have questions on that, you can definitely contact me or look it up. So yeah, there are always other options, and this option is not going to be the perfect option for everyone. And the big thing, like Pam said, please don't do it alone. There are lots of supports out there. I'm not saying that you have to come and see me, but definitely helpful to get a dietitian involved. We're pretty good at, turning those grams of protein into meals. But if you have, your healthcare team that you trust, talk to your doctor or your naturopath or whoever it is that you work with and see if they think this is right for you. And you're going to want to work with them to make sure that you're adjusting your medications as needed and that you're getting the nutrition that you need. There's a couple more resources there, which I think we can send to you after, just some places to find recipes that are good for low protein, high protein, and then our contact info. And I guess we'll open the floor to questions.